When I first heard about the Insta360 One X and later the One X2, I wasn't really sure what all the fuss was about, and I didn't think it was something that I would ever use in my films. Well, it turns out that I was wrong. If you're new to the channel, my name is Jeff Peltier, and I'm a trail runner and filmmaker, and for years now I've relied almost exclusively on a GoPro as my only action camera for all my adventure films. So in this video, I'm going to explain how the Insta360 One X2 has found a place in my storytelling toolbox. But I'll also explain some of the camera's limitations. And as a disclosure, this camera was sent to me by Insta360 to review, which I was allowed to keep, but they did not see this video before I published it, nor do they have any input into what I would say. In fact, I think they've probably forgotten I had it, given that it's taken me almost a year to create this review. But I wanted to make sure that I'd really put it to the test before giving you my opinion on it. Now, my first real introduction to this camera was by my friend Gary Robbins, who uses it pretty much exclusively for his videos. And for him, I think it works really well. He was looking for something quick and easy to use for filming videos like a series that he calls Mountain Monologues and Downhill Dialogues, where he talks about his training and gives helpful tips, all while out on a run. But for the kind of films that I make, I always found that a 360 camera just presented too many limitations. Its resolution, the field of view, and the post-production workflow, just to name a few. But I think I was looking at the camera in the wrong way.
Woo! Oh, wow.
These lenses scratch so easily.
When it comes to photography and videography, using something like a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, there really is no such thing as the perfect lens. You might need to use a zoom lens for travel, for example, where you prefer something light and with a fairly big range in terms of focal length. Most of us would then use a prime lens for, say, portraits when shooting stills or for interviews when shooting a documentary, since these tend to be a little bit sharper and faster. But you then want a much longer lens for shooting something like wildlife. And of course, there's a time and a place for a much wider lens as well. And this is what I mean when I talk about focal length or field of view. It's a question of how narrow or how wide your lens is. And that's where the Insta360 One X2 comes in for me. It's essentially like having one more very specialized lens in my storytelling toolbox. But the limitations of this camera are very real, and just like how you wouldn't start by purchasing only a really long or a really wide lens for a mirrorless camera, I also don't think it's really possible to get away with telling stories only with a 360 camera. But to really explain what I think the camera is good at, I want to start by explaining these limitations in more detail. The first is the camera's resolution. The Insta360 One X2 films at a maximum of 5.7K resolution, which on the surface sounds really good, even slightly better than the maximum resolution of 5.3K on the GoPro Hero 10. Now, in both cases, that resolution is technically a little higher than I actually need since I edit and publish my films in 4K, although it is nice to always have a little extra in case you need to reframe a shot. The thing to remember, though, is that a 360 camera spreads this resolution out over a 360-degree field of view. And that's because a 360 camera is capturing all around you all the time, up, down, in front, and behind. This gives you tremendous flexibility in post-production because you can really just stick the camera up in the air without having to worry about which direction it's pointing. And later, using the Insta360 Studio app, you can then choose and reframe your shot. And I'll sometimes output multiple versions of the same shot, with one pointing maybe forward and one looking back down at me, or even off to the side or behind me. And I can then edit these together into a bit of a sequence, giving me what we'd refer to in the industry as additional coverage, all from a single shot. But each of these angles will only use a fraction of that original 5.7K resolution, unless I use the little planet effect, in which case it's using every pixel. I'll usually frame my shots pretty narrowly though, bringing the resolution down to something closer to 1080p. Now compare this to the GoPro, which allows you to change the field of view in camera. I'll typically use a linear field of view for filming distortion-free landscape shots, and I'll switch to a wider field of view only for filming sort of selfie angles, like when I'm talking to the camera. Now, using a more narrow field of view does mean that I'm not using the full sensor of the GoPro, but at least it's recording that shot at full 4K resolution and at full bitrate. Now, to get that same linear field of view on the Insta360, Again, I'm back to maybe around a 1080p image once I output the final composition from the Insta360 Studio app, which for many filmmakers may be just fine. But it would definitely be great if the Insta360 One X2 was available with something closer to an 8K sensor, leaving me with a bit more of a buffer. When it comes to post-production, the Insta360 One X2 does offer a lot of extra flexibility, as I mentioned before, but this comes at a huge price in terms of time. I need to first spend time reframing each clip in the Insta360 Studio app, and then outputting them to either H.264 or ProRes files to import into my editing software, which can take a lot of time if you're on a slower machine. Now, there is a plugin available for Adobe users from GoPro that was designed for the GoPro 360 Max camera, which works with the Insta360 One X2 in both Premiere and After Effects. But in my experience, it's very processor heavy and it creates for some really long render times when you're outputting your final video. So I definitely recommend processing your 360 videos first. And this also means that you'll be increasing your file storage requirements, since you're probably going to want to keep a copy of those original 360 files as well as the outputs from the Insta360 Studio software. Now compare this to when working with GoPro files, where again, I'm personally in the habit of changing my focal length in camera, so there's no additional work required before editing the video files, at least not on my machine. On my Mac Mini M1, I'm able to work with the H.265 files from my GoPro natively in DaVinci Resolve just fine. Having said that, when working on older Macs, you would get better performance by first transcoding your GoPro footage to ProRes as well, meaning your file storage requirements might end up being about the same as those from the Insta360 One X2. Now, there are also some other artifacts and issues when filming with the 360 camera that you don't get from regular action cameras. The first is the seam that can sometimes appear when the shot from the front and rear lenses are stitched together. The Insta360 One X can be recalibrated to help avoid this, but it's still sometimes noticeable because of lens flare, which can distort the image from whichever lens is facing directly into the sun or another bright light source. But this is less of an issue when filming in more consistent lighting, like on a cloudy day. Whereas with the GoPro, it's sometimes possible to sort of shade the lens with your hand when the sun is just outside of your frame, as I often find myself doing. I also find that the footage from a 360 camera is just a little bit muddier and grainier, especially in low light. And there tends to be additional compression artifacts near the edges of the frame where the lens correction is being done in post and the pixels are sort of being stretched out. And while the microphone on the Insta360 One X2 is actually surprisingly good, and it does a decent job of reducing wind noise, it is noticeably quieter than the GoPro. I think mainly because it's just further away from your face when it's extended out on the pole, so it can pick up a lot more of the ambient sound in the environment.
We're just traversing below grouse, and it's quite steep. There's a lot of creeks and drainages, and it creates a lot of erosion, and the trails are quite technical, but it also kind of feels like you're going uphill both ways. It's not so bad on the way out, but much more difficult on the way back. So it helps to have a pacer. And fortunately, I think my friend Matt's going to be joining me. So he's going to be on fresh legs and he'll be able to keep me moving.
You've probably heard the expression that to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But sometimes what you really need is a screwdriver, or more specifically, one invented by a Canadian, the Robertson head screwdriver. And similarly, there are cases where the Insta360 One X2 is by far the best tool for the job, and other times when it's not. Now, first of all, only a 360 camera will automatically remove the selfie stick like the Insta360 One X2 or the GoPro 360 Max does. This allows you to get some really interesting shots without the distraction of a big pole, and it can even allow you to capture shots that some in your audience will think must have been filmed with a drone. And that extra wide field of view is by far the best way to accentuate those ridges and make them look even more dramatic than they do in real life. And while a GoPro on a selfie stick in a super wide field of view can get pretty close, it won't remove the selfie stick from the shot. And the stabilization on the Insta360 One X2 is pretty incredible. And that's thanks in part to the flow state stabilization that the Insta360 Studio software uses when it renders the files, but also just because of how wide the lens is. And the wider the field of view, the more stable a shot tends to be on any camera. I also just love that extra wide angle to provide an additional perspective when running through different types of terrain. Even outside of ridges and mountains, it can help to accentuate the vastness of flat terrain as well. And take it from me, trying to film these with a regular lens on a GoPro usually just results in a mostly empty frame. The key here, though, I find is to use these shots in moderation. It's a lot like drone footage. And personally, I find videos shot entirely with a drone to be pretty boring, and it's hard to tell an actual story using only a drone. In my opinion, the best way to use a drone is very sparingly for dramatic effect. A properly placed drone sequence can not only help to demonstrate scale and perspective in a landscape, but it can also elicit an emotional response. But beyond that, it can just be too much of a good thing. Using a 360 camera in moderation and only to supplement a film also helps to reduce some of those limitations that I mentioned earlier. Having only a handful of shots to process in Insta360 Studio is a lot less work than the hundreds of shots that I might otherwise have if I tried to film an entire adventure with this camera. And I find I can get away with upscaling the odd lower resolution shot from the Insta360 One X2 when placed alongside other higher resolution footage in a 4K timeline. But for all of these reasons, I don't think I would recommend using a 360 camera as a direct replacement for something like a GoPro. And I probably wouldn't use it heavily for shots that you could get otherwise with a regular action camera, which will give you a much better quality image with better sound and with a lot less post-processing required. So that's how I use the Insta360 One X2 now. I've got my GoPro Hero 10, which is my primary go-to action camera. I've then got the Insta360 Go 2 for the odd scene where I know I want to film hands-free POV shots. I've got my mirrorless camera and my drone, which I mostly use for before and after adventures, as well as for videos like this. And then I've got my Insta360 One X2 for films that I know would really benefit from that extra wide point of view. And I'd hope you'd agree that including these shots in some of the films that I've produced in the last year has really helped me to tell more engaging stories and to bring some of these dramatic landscapes to life. So how about you? Do you think that the Insta360 One X2 would be a good addition to your storytelling toolbox? Or do you think you could get away with using this as your primary action camera? Tell me about it in the comments below and give this video a like if you found it helpful. And speaking of dramatic landscapes, my video series from my recent adventure in Namibia is almost ready, and it will feature shots from the Insta360 One X2 as well, so be sure to subscribe to be notified of that.